Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us, and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Good morning. Our scripture this morning is from 1 Kings 12, 1 through 11. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. "How would you advise me to answer these people?" he asked. They replied, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He asked them, "What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him replied, "These people have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter.' Now tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." May the Lord bless the reading and hearing of his word.
I have here a Jenga tower, or half of one at least. I was afraid to go the full length. It probably would have fallen. But how many of you played Jenga before? Okay, most of you are familiar with it. It's one of my favorite games. What I love about Jenga is that it doesn't take a lot of rules or explanations. I can remember playing down with the kids in Haiti in the orphanage, and they loved it just as the kids in my family did. When you play Jenga, it's very simple. You have a little tower of blocks stacked 3 by 3 by 3 upon each other, and you take turns kind of picking a block, removing it, and then adding it to the top. And, different households have different levels of strictness, I would say. I grew up in a home where you could, touch as many blocks as you wanted to find the one that was a little bit weaker than all the rest. And some people play once you touch a block, you're stuck to it. You got to remove it, no matter what. But the idea is the longer you play Jenga, 2 things happen. One, the tower keeps getting taller and taller and taller as more blocks are placed on the top. But on the other hand, the other thing that happens is the foundation starts to get weaker and weaker and weaker. The whole thing starts to wobble more and more as blocks are removed from the bottom, until eventually the whole thing gets really shaky, and the slightest little bit of friction causes the whole thing to come tumbling down. And whoever it is who pulls the last fateful block, they lost the game. And then everyone picks up the blocks and you play it all over again. That's the game of Jenga. Well, over the last month, we have spent time looking at the rise and fall of early Israel, the 1 century or so in the 120 years of their history when they were a united monarchy together. And in some ways, I think the Jenga tower is a perfect illustration of this period of history that we have been looking at. Because over the course of the leadership of first Saul, then David, then Solomon, The tower of Israel, so to speak, kept getting taller and taller and taller. The kingdom expanded exponentially. You can see from the map, all the way from the small red territory, all the way to the orange and yellow as well. I mean, the kingdom expanded dramatically. And today we're going to look at poor Rehoboam, the last king, who pulled the last fateful block and it all came tumbling down. But here's the thing. Just like in the game of Jenga, one person pulls the last block, but everyone contributes to the shakiness of the foundation. In the same way, that's what the story of Israel has been. Yes, the kingdom has grown taller and taller and taller, but as we've seen, each leader, each king contributed a little bit to making the foundation a little bit weaker. They all took their own blocks, so to speak, from the tower. So let's start, just by way of recap. We started off with King Saul. And as we saw King Saul, first king of Israel, he was very insecure. Instead of embracing David as the next and future king of Israel, instead he was deeply threatened by David, so obsessed and so insecure that he tried on multiple occasions to have David killed. And David had to run and escape and raise up his own army. And Saul plunged the nation of Israel into a civil war trapped between those who were pro-Saul and pro-David. And that sowed the seeds of discord. That was the fault line that continued to grow and grow over the course of Israel's history. After Saul came David, the next king. And even though David is celebrated as, the greatest king in Israel's history, a man after God's own heart, despite all those things we found as we kind of looked at David's story, David had a particular fault. And his fault was permissiveness. He allowed great evil to take place in his own family. And then for a period of over a decade, he did nothing about it. He created this culture of silence, and it allowed that evil to fester and grow. Remember the quote we used from author Henry Cloud, that leaders are responsible not just for what they create, but also for what they allow. And David allowed great evil, and that evil kind of grew until finally his son Absalom rose up in rebellion against him. And what happened again? The country was split along the same fault lines as a generation before. It all happened all over again. David put down the rebellion. Absalom was killed. The country was reunited, kind of patched back together. And then Solomon became king. And finally with Solomon, he had a period of peace for 40 years. No external threat, no internal civil war. The kingdom grew and grew and became prosperous and rich. But along that way, as Solomon, in particular as king, became wealthier and wealthier, he forgot who he was. He forgot where he came from. He lost touch with the humility that once caused him to pray for wisdom instead of all the goods of the world. He forgot the God who had gave him that wisdom and gave him the platform, the kingdom in which, the authority which he held. Instead, his wives, his many, many wives, turned his heart away. He worshiped foreign gods, and God declared to him, "Because you have turned away from me, I will tear from you the kingdom. I will take 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, and I will give them not to your son, but to your servant Jeroboam." Now that's where we left the story last week. So that kind of sets the table as we look at the story of Rehoboam. And you may be thinking, as I kind of lay out those, that sequence of history, that Rehoboam didn't have a chance, right? The deck was already stacked. It was going to fall no matter what. And maybe that was true. But as we're going to see today, Rehoboam had his own unique contribution to the story of Israel, his own participation in its fall. So let's pick up the story with Jeroboam. Solomon hears that the prophet has gone to Jeroboam and promised him 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so Solomon does what any king would do in that situation. He tried to have Jeroboam killed. And Jeroboam escapes, and he goes down to Egypt and lives as a fugitive for a few years until Solomon passes away. And when Solomon passes away, his son, Rehoboam, becomes king. And I just want to caution you here, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the Bible did not do us any favors. It did not do me any favors as a preacher. I'm sure at some point in this sermon, I'm going to mix those names up, and that's okay. Just try to remember, Rehoboam is Solomon's son. Jeroboam is Solomon's servant, who God appointed to rule over 10 of the 12 tribes. Okay, but Jeroboam's down in Egypt. Rehoboam becomes king in his father's place. He goes up to Shechem, where he's going to be crowned, coronated as king, and word reaches Jeroboam all the way down in Egypt that this is happening, and so Jeroboam comes back, and this is kind of the showdown between the two of them. Now, what's important to understand is that when Jeroboam returns from Egypt, he's not seeking rebellion. He's not coming to claim his right as a ruler and as a leader. Instead, when he comes up as an advocate for the people of Israel. What he's seeking, what he's arguing for, is relief. You see, Rehoboam inherited a kingdom that was growing, that was prosperous, that was rich. But Rehoboam also inherited a kingdom that was tired, very tired. For decade after decade after decade, the people of Israel had been building Solomon's glories, the temple, the palace. I mean, for over 2 decades, they've been in this great building project, and people had been conscripted into forced labor. The taxes placed upon them were astronomical, not just for these great building projects, which were inlaid with gold and silver and every kind of wonder possible, but also just for the King Solomon's lifestyle. He liked to live large and rich, and he had over 1,000 wives, and it was the burden of the people of Israel to support this lavish lifestyle and all of these wives, right? And so they were tired. And on top of that, there's the extra problem that was taking place is that Jerusalem was located in the southern tribe of Judah, which meant Jerusalem and Judah was receiving all the benefits of these taxations and these forced labors. And the people in the northern tribes felt like, hey, we're paying taxes, we're working hard, and we're receiving none of the benefit because none of these wonders, none of these riches are enriching us. In other words, it was kind of a version of our own story as a country. Taxation without representation, taxation without benefit. They just wanted someone to listen to them. They just wanted their concerns and their problems to be acknowledged. And so Jeroboam comes up from Egypt to be the voice of the people of Israel to Rehoboam. And he says to them, your father laid on us a heavy yoke. For decades now, we've been laboring under him. But now, if you will just lighten the harsh labor, the heavy yoke, the taxes that he put upon us, we will serve you. In other words, no more building projects, no more 1,000 wives. Just ease up. Let us live in peace, and we promise we'll be loyal to you. It's a fair request, right? Rehoboam does the smart thing. He says, well, give me 3 days to consider it, and I'll come back and meet with you in 3 days. And in those 3 days, as he's considering, he decides, well, I need to seek some counsel, some advice from others. And so first he goes to his father's advisors, the people who kind of gave him counsel and wisdom over the course of his reign. And when he goes to his father's advisors and asks them, what do you think of this request? The advisors say, yeah, we think this is a fair and good idea. In fact, literally what the Bible says, if today you'll be a servant to these people, if you'll let go of your ego, and if you will serve them and give them a favorable answer, then they will be your servants. In other words, give a little here, and you'll get back more than you gave away. You'll earn their trust. You'll earn their friendship. This is the pathway to peace. But Rehoboam doesn't really like this advice. So he goes out and he seeks out some other counsel. And instead of turning to his father's trusted advisors, he turns to his friends, the people he grew up with, the people who have kind of that yes group that has always surrounded him. And he says, what do you think? And they give the exact opposite advice. They say, if you give in now, they're going to think you're weak. They're going to walk all over you. The rest of your reign, you're going to be their whipping boy. And so they say to him, now tell these Israelites that my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid a heavy yoke on you. I'm going to make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I'm going to whip you with scorpions. Now, two very different sets of advice, right? And one of them is clearly wise. The other, the set of advice that comes from his friends, not wise, obviously, but what it does have the advantage of is it appeals to Rehoboam's ego. His need, his desire to establish himself, his own illusions of grandeur and importance, maybe even his insecurity about living in the shadow of his father. And you can see where this is going because that's where his ego went. And so 3 days later, Rehoboam meets with Jeroboam and all the leaders of Israel, and he repeats verbatim, word for word, the advice he received from his friends. My father made your yoke heavy. I'm going to make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. And the reaction, the consequences were swift. The Israelites instantly rebelled against Rehoboam. They cried out, "To your tents, O Israel! What part do we have in the house of David? What part do we have in Jesse's son? To your tents! Look after your own house, David." In other words, Judah, you do what you want. We are going a separate way now. They rose up in rebellion. Now, Rehoboam perhaps at this point realized, I've made a mistake. I've pushed it too far. And so he sent his chief advisor, Adoniram, who interestingly had replaced Jeroboam as being in charge of all the forced labor in Israel. And he sent Adoniram after him and tried to negotiate with him and bring them back to the table. But the Israelites were done. They were through listening to Rehoboam. In fact, they stoned Adoniram, killed him. And that's when Rehoboam realized, if I stay here, I might be killed too. And so he fled off in his chariot, went back down to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, there at the council, all the Israelites decided, the Bible says, when all of Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they anointed him king over all of Israel. So they made him king over Israel, and only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. There was the division that took place. Now, Rehoboam wasn't going to lay down, and just take this. He thought, well, as my grandfather once put down the rebellion with force, I'm going to do the same. He gathered up an army of 180,000 men, marched up into Israel. But before they did battle, God sent word to Rehoboam and to all the people of his army. And he said, do not fight against your brothers, the Israelites, but go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. And for the first time, Rehoboam listened, turned around, and from thenceforth, through the rest of the Old Testament, there was no longer a unified Israel. There's a northern kingdom called Israel, and there's a southern kingdom called Judah. The two would never come together again. The northern kingdom would eventually be wiped out by the Assyrians, the southern kingdom wiped out by the Babylonians. That's the story of Israel. So what was Rehoboam's fault? What's the lesson here for us today? What's Rehoboam's key mistake that led to the downfall, to the forever split of God's people, the Israelites? Well, certainly you could point to his ego. I mean, it's a pretty big deal when you're saying, my finger is thicker than my father's waist, like he was trying to exalt himself over Solomon. He certainly had an inflated view of himself, and maybe connected to that inflation was also insecurity, an inability to listen to others, to share decision-making and power. But the Bible is really clear that the real fault that Rehoboam had was that he was hard of hearing. In verse 15, it says, Rehoboam refused to listen to the people of Israel. And then in verse 16, it repeats, because Rehoboam refused to listen to the people, the Israelites turned against him. He simply did not listen. Except maybe that's stating it a little too harshly. Because Rehoboam did listen. It wasn't that he just didn't listen to the right set of advice, right? There was a group of people that he listened to quite closely. So closely, in fact, that he repeated their words, word for word verbatim when he met with the Israelites in Shechem. That he sought lots of opinions and views. The problem is that Rehoboam had selective hearing. He only heard what he wanted to hear. And that, my friends, is an affliction which troubles us still today. I like this little meme that I found on the internet, someone putting in a hearing aid saying, it's a special hearing aid. It filters out criticism and amplifies compliments. That's what Rehoboam had, but so do we today. We don't like listening to things that we don't want to hear. I heard a sermon a little over a year ago from a pastor named David Callis, who was preaching on this exact story of Rehoboam. And he pointed out the same thing, how Rehoboam had selective hearing, that he just listened to what he wanted to listen. But what was interesting is then David Callis reflected on himself. He said, I've grown to the age where I literally have a bad ear. It's a physical ailment. How many of you have a bad ear? Okay, handful of you got it. And he said, so in my condition is, I only hear well out of one side. If someone speaks to me through the wrong ear, it's muffled, distorted. It just sounds like a bunch of noise and mumbling, white noise. So I have to turn my good ear to them in order for the words to have clarity and for me to be able to know what it means. And then as he kind of described that condition, he then said, but even before I had this physical ailment, I had a spiritual ailment, one that is true of pretty much everyone in our country, in our world today. And I remember he said this, and it hit me so hard. He said, some of you hear really, really well out of the left side of your ear. Politically, theologically, you hear with perfect clarity from the left, but anything that comes from the right, you mishear. It's distorted. It's twisted somehow. And he said, many of you, before you cast stones of judgment, many of you hear well, perfectly well out of the right side. You hear perfectly what they're trying to say, but anything that comes from the left gets distorted and twisted and misheard and dismissed. All of us, myself included, like Rehoboam, we like to hear what we want to hear. And we do not hear well the things we don't want to hear. We don't hear well the things that challenge what we think we already know. And this is especially true in today's world, our day and age where we have so many different news apps and news channels that honestly filter for us the information that's coming to us. Like a lot of times when we're getting information and news, it's already pre-screened. And so it just increases this sense of being in an echo chamber, that we keep hearing the voices that confirm what we already believe and think, and we keep throwing stones at the other side that just sound confusing and lost. We have to learn the lesson of Rehoboam. And the lesson of Rehoboam is this, that when we fail to listen, what's the consequence? What happened to Rehoboam? Division. When we cannot listen to one another, we divide. And as Abraham Lincoln famously said, a house divided cannot stand. That's the pathway we've been on as a country, and not just as a country, as a church, as a community. We see this division, this fault line growing deeper and deeper and deeper because of our failure to listen to one another, because we hear well out of one side and we have no interest in hearing out of the other. And this isn't to say that all sides are equally correct. Because I think that's part of the challenge. Is like, well, wait, but I'm right, they're wrong, right? This isn't to say that all sides are equally correct. And as leaders, sometimes you have to make a choice. And when you make a choice, you're going to upset some people. Not everyone gets to make the decision. So sometimes this isn't to say that all voices and viewpoints are equally correct. It is to say that no one person of us is 100% correct and never wrong. That's why we need to listen to one another, because none of us has all the answers. And if we think we do, then we're setting ourselves up for a fall. And even when we encounter viewpoints and voices from others that upset us, that frustrate us, that anger us, even in those moments we have to remember that those viewpoints and voices, that they're held by people who are created in the divine image of God, who are loved by him and whom we are called to love and serve in humility. So let us remember the advice that the good advisors gave to Rehoboam. If you this day will serve them, they will serve you back. If we could just learn to treat one another with love and service and listening, honoring one another, I think this world would become a much better place. So this wraps up our series on the rise and fall of early Israel. And I acknowledge there's been a lot of history in these sermons. Probably somewhere in this, you've heard some history that you didn't realize, or maybe that you've forgotten. Not all of this was covered in Sunday school. We never talked about Absalom and Tamar or anything like that when I was in Sunday school. So this may be new information entirely. And so why would we spend this time talking about the ancient leaders of Israel? Well, the first thing that I hope you have seen is that we rise and fall with leadership. I mean, God gives us the gift of leadership. Every single one of us, I believe, in this room, we have some place, some platform where we are a leader in our families, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our churches. I mean, we all of us are called to exercise leadership at some place. And we rise and fall with good leadership. And that's not just true of countries and nations, it's true of communities and of churches too. We're all called to exercise leadership. The second thing I hope you see is that we're all pretty imperfect leaders. Like, not one of these leaders of early Israel was perfect. Some of them were tragically flawed. And even the great ones, David and Solomon, I mean, the Israel flourished under them, but even they had their faults and failures. And so no one of us is perfect. Remember what I said in the first week? Leadership is like a magnifying glass. And, a big magnifying glass placed on the leader. And when you're in leadership, your gifts and your graces, your wisdom get magnified, but so do your faults. Yes, leadership is a place where our sin and brokenness show up. But that's where the grace of God comes in. Because the beauty of this story, even of the rise and fall of early Israel, the beauty of the story is that God works through imperfect leaders in order to accomplish his plan, in order to accomplish his purposes. He even works through our mistakes. And so if God could do that in the story of the Old Testament, he could do that today in our world and in our church and in our lives. God works through imperfect leaders like you and me when we trust in his grace. And the third lesson I hope you get is that yes, we are called to leadership, and yes, we are each imperfect, but we can learn from the faults and failures of others, and by God's grace, we can be better leaders ourselves. So yes, we've looked at leaders who were hard of hearing. We've looked at leaders who were permissive, forgetful, insecure. But my hope is that we can learn from them and be different kinds of leaders in our world. That through God's grace, we become leaders who aren't hard of hearing, but instead leaders who deeply listen to the people around us, who listen to God's Spirit, listen especially to voices and viewpoints that are different from our own. That we might become leaders who aren't forgetful of where we've come from, but leaders who remember who we are, where we've come from, how we got here, and that stay tethered to the humility and faith that we had when we first embarked on the journey of leadership. That we would be leaders who address issues, who have the courage and strength to speak up when necessary, who pay attention not just to what we're creating, but also to what we're allowing. And that we would be leaders who are not insecure, but leaders who are secure in the grace of God, who faithfully do the work that God has entrusted to us, but who entrust in turn to God All the rest, the outcomes, all the things we can't control, we entrust that back to God, and we trust and know that in all things he is working for his purpose and his pleasure. Yes, if you're in leadership, you're going to fall at some point. That's the painful part of the rise and fall, is every single one of us it's not just part of leadership, it's part of life. Every single one of us at some point will fall flat on our faces. But the good news is that through God's grace, through his Son, Jesus Christ, he gives us each the power to rise again. And through his Spirit, he gives us the courage to help others rise as well. And so it's in his name that I offer these words of encouragement and grace to you. Amen.
Good morning. My name is Tracy Vermillion, and I am the Director of Children's Ministry here at Zionsville UMC. Thank you for joining us today. We would love to get to know you more and spend more time with you. If you'd like to know more about our faith community, please visit our church website at zumc.org. There, you'll find the many ministry opportunities we have to offer. If you need to contact one of our staff members, all our contact information is at the bottom of all the church web pages. You also can connect with us via social media throughout your week for daily inspiration and community. You'll find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube under username Zionsville UMC. Once again, thank you for joining us this morning, and we hope you have a wonderful week.